What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you the classes of Elden Ring ranked. Now, there's a few different ways you could really do this, and the two that I decided on were tier list as well as my overall ranking. This is largely because, depending on the type of playstyle you'd like to start the game with, the best class for you is going to vary. And that brings me to my second main point for the classes, is that they really define your starting experience with the game and how you approach it. Because while probably 20 or 30 hours in for most people, you'll get the option to respec and you can really kind of move into anything you want at that point. Your starting experience, and how optimal that is, if you'd like to put it that way, is largely dependent on your class, because this is going to set your stats and your starting equipment, which is really going to define how you play the game for the first while. And given that there are multiple play styles, I figured for the start of this video would start with a tier list of sorts, based on the starting experience for melee, magic, or a hybrid class. Now, for our top tier classes, for melee, it is none other than the Vagabond, which should be a surprise to no one. The Vagabond has the overall best stat spread for a melee class at the beginning of the game. So you can pick Vagabond, and if you want to, change out the armor and stuff with different types of things you can find towards the beginning of the game and move him quickly into whatever type of melee character you really want to play as. Because, again, his stats are pretty much top tier for that. But even if you choose to go with the gear that you're given, if you will, you're still going to have a pretty good time because, again, you have the best starting stats that you can for a melee character. Now, for our top tier magic user, that is none other than the Astrologer, primarily because this is one of the classes that will start you out using sorceries, and magic is very strong. Now, early game, you'll actually find this a little tough because you don't have a lot of resources via your flasks to replenish your mana, so you might find yourself resting more often and or relying on very little health or your ability to dodge to survive. But late game, that issue kind of goes away as your stats increase. But early game, it can very much so be an issue. But Astrologer is your best magic user for sure. And then for our top tier hybrid class, we are looking at the Prisoner. Now they start off with an S stock as well as some sorceries as well, which means if you would like to mix a bit of melee and magic, Prisoner's really the way to go here. That said, stat-wise, they're a little mixed in some ways. They don't have a really high magic stats or really high melee stats because they're trying to mix both of those things. In combination with this, your equipment is just okay, outside of the weapons, which are really giving you what you're picking this class for, I would say. But nonetheless, the Prisoner is the best hybrid class because then you can use the sorceries that the Astrologer gets right out of the gate, as well as being able to use your melee capabilities should you so choose. Now let's move on to the mid-tier guys. Our mid-tier melee character is the Samurai. So the stats are a little worse than the Vagabond, however they start the game with a bleed weapon via their katana. If you're unaware, bleed is incredibly effective in this game, which means starting as a Samurai, as long as you have a basic understanding of the dodge mechanic, you're going to have a pretty good time. Combine that with their actually really good defensive armor for the beginning of the game, and you've got a great character that's going to be very defensive and do a ton of damage via their bleed effect. And really, the only drawback here is the stats are slightly worse than the Vagabonds. However, if you know where some of these items are, you can just get the Vagabond, swap out all their armor for the equivalent of the Samurais, which does take a little extra work, but you can do it. And you have basically the Samurai, but with the Vagabond stats. Hence why the Samurai comes second. Now, for our mid-tier magic user, we have the Prophet. So the Prophet is another pure magic class, but the thing is they use faith-based incantations instead. And ultimately, I put them a little bit behind the Astrologer, primarily because they have a bit more utility with their spells when it comes to incantations. And on one hand, that's a plus for some people. The variety can be quite welcome, because with the Astrologer, you're going to just be spamming the same spell a lot. And while it is more reliable damage, in my opinion, especially towards the beginning of the game, where you don't have a lot of incantations that deal a ton of damage, I will say that the Prophet is a more interesting class to play simply because there's more going on. Their spells give you more utility. There's things like buffs, different types of attacks. Whereas, again, with the Astrologer, you're going to do more damage at the beginning, but ultimately you're kind of just spamming the same attack over and over again, which for some people is pretty boring. So if people prefer the Prophet, I get it. But purely from a damage perspective and stats, Astrologer is the better magic user at the beginning. Late game, however, you can get a lot of really cool incantations that make the faith-based builds a lot more interesting. However, I will say that late game, you could make anyone do that. You don't need the prophet specifically. Now, for our mid-tier hybrid class, we have the Confessor. The Confessor is the faith-based version of the Prisoner, if you will. The Confessor actually also has the highest starting level of all of the actual classes, and their stats are kind of decent. Like most of the hybrids, it's kind of a mixed bag. However, they're going to be decent at melee combat, and they're going to get some faith-based incantations. The only real issue here is that the incantations they start you with are a little underwhelming. You get a heal as well as a spell that kind of quiets your movements, which isn't super necessary. So the quiet your movement one is basically useless if you understand the sneak system anyway. But the heal can be pretty useful early game if you make use of it. But ultimately, I think it pales in comparison to the Prisoner as a hybrid class. Now, let's talk bottom tier. We actually do have one more tier to go after this, but the bottom tier only has 2 classes because there is no other pure magic user at this point, which means we're talking melee and hybrid. Now, for our bottom tier melee class, we have the Hero. Now, on one hand, the Hero starts the game with the best strength. They also start the game with a 2-handed weapon, so if you want to start the game with those stats, I can see why you would pick the Hero. However, again, the Vagabond has better stats overall, albeit with slightly less strength, and you can just give the Vagabond a 2-handed weapon, plus they have better armor, so there's really just not a lot of point to pick the Hero, in my opinion, unless you just really want that extra bit of strength, and as such, they're kind of a lower tier melee start. And then for our hybrid bottom tier, we have the Bandit. Now, some people might not even consider the Bandit a hybrid, but I do, largely because they gave them a bow, and the fact that they have the highest arcane stat at the start of the game. So if you're unaware of what the arcane stat actually does, it gives you the highest discovery, which is your chance to find items, as well as increases the rate at which enemies will get hit by status effects. So you combine this with the fact that the Bandit starts with the Great Knife, which is also a bleed weapon, and you have a really good chance of bleeding characters early game. The downside to this is the Great Knife has a very short range compared to a katana, and the fact that the Bandit has one of the lower starting levels, and while certainly not unusable, I would say that the Bandit is one of the bottom of the barrel classes you could pick. And now let's wrap it up with our worst classes, because I couldn't think of anything below bottom tier. And this is our Warrior and our Wretch. So the Warrior is a melee character, and on one hand, they are the only class that starts out dual wielding. And if you want to build a specifically built dex build, you could potentially do that with the Warrior. But again, like all the other melee classes, ultimately you could just pick the Vagabond, swap some equipment out, and you'd be better off for it. Now, while the Hero has the highest strength and the Samurai has really good starting equipment, in my opinion, there's just not a lot of use cases for the Warrior unless you just really want to start out dual wielding and not have to put any work into it. Which, for some people, that works. And then very bottom tier is, of course, the Wretch. They have the worst stat spread, even though they are a bit of a blank slate. And they, at the end of the day, start with no equipment, which makes them pretty useless. Now, honestly, every single one of these classes is useful if you put the time into it to level them up for starters, or if you know what stats you need, you can pick the class that has the best stats for you and then just swap their equipment out if you know where to find it, a lot of which can be done pretty early in the game. But tier-wise, that's kind of the best starts you're looking at for these classes. Now from here, let's talk about my overall rankings for just the classes, period. I've kind of already talked about these, so I'll just kind of quickly go through them for you. Number 1, we have the Vagabond. Again, fantastic stat spread, pretty much the way to go for the melee character. 2, the Samurai. They have a bleed effect weapon that has a very good range. They have amazing defensive equipment, which makes them a fantastic starting choice. Third up, we have the Astrologer. A great pick for the people trying to get into the sorceries of the game. I will say though, beginning of the game is very repetitive. You're just spamming the same spell over and over again, which gets a little boring. In the 4th spot, we have the Prophet. Bit of a slower start damage-wise than the Astrologer, but they can quickly become much more interesting due to the variety of interesting effects that are provided by the mutations. In our 5th spot, we have the Prisoner, which is a fantastic hybrid class if you're trying to go melee and magic. Then in our 6th spot, we have the Confessor. I like the Confessor because it is a magic user that uses the faith-based incantations as well as blends into the melee a little bit. However, again, damage is going to be a bit behind the Prisoner. In our number 7 spot, we have the Hero, just because they have the highest strength at the start. And while they are, in my opinion, inferior to the Vagabond, I can see why someone would pick them. Then we have the Warrior. Again, unless you want to just start as a dual wielder, there's really no point. Number 9, we have the Bandit. Again, low class level, a stat almost no one uses, short range weapon with their bleed effect. It just, all around. And then, last but not least, we have the Wretch, just because in comparison to everyone else, they're going to give you a terrible starting experience, even if you do turn them into something really good at the end. So there you go, guys. There are the classes of Elden Ring ranked by tier and by overall list. Hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please consider leaving a like, commenting, subscribing, all that YouTube jazz. Let me know about your own personal rankings down below, because while I tried to be a little bit objective, at the end of the day, this is all just opinion-based, and every single one of these characters is very capable of getting through the game and ultimately becoming the build you want to make them. So, again, hope you enjoyed the video. Thank you so much for watching. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.